Hello and welcome to another video review. This is FTL Faster Than Light for PC, Mac, Linux, and iOS. This is an interesting hybrid of strategy and roguelike mechanics that was developed by Subset Games and first released in September 2012. Although what you're seeing in this video is Advanced Edition, which is a free content update that came out in April of this year. If you get the game now, it will obviously include the Advanced Edition content, but you can actually turn that off as you wish, should you prefer to play the vanilla game. So, the question then becomes, does this game really deserve all the coverage it got on YouTube? I mean, there was a lot of buzz around this thing when it came out. A lot of YouTubers were playing it, and I've used it in a few videos here and there myself. But now I come to the actual time to review it, and the question is it really that good? Because it did get quite a lot of praise when it came out. Well, as far as presentation goes, it certainly doesn't impress very much. It's not to say that the presentation is bad, far from it, it's actually pretty well done. It's that the pixel art style that they've gone for is just tiresome. These days, pretty much every single indie game we see is in a pixel art style, and we're just tired of it. It's not to say that the art's bad in this game, it's not. It's actually quite good. There's quite a bit of detail in the actual rooms of the ships. The characters have enough detail where you can tell what characters are what, although it's nothing particularly impressive, and in fact the animations look kind of awful. But they've managed to pull off an art style that is at least charming. It's full of color, there's a lot of good things going for it, but it's just that we've seen so many pixel art games these days that we're just kind of tired of it. It's a bit of a shame, really. It's not the game's fault, it's the industry's fault. But then there's the sound design. Sound design is a lot better, particularly in regards to the music, which was done by Ben Prunty. It's a very catchy, very charming soundtrack that fits very, very well. Really has that nice sci-fi feel to it, and so that really does add a lot to the charm of the game. Sound effects feel suitably sci-fi. When you're firing lasers, they sound like lasers. When you're firing beam weapons, they sound like beam weapons, so on and so forth. And it all fits together quite well. It's just that the presentation is not particularly impressive, apart from that music, which is very, very well done. But obviously what really matter here are the story and the gameplay. And the story in this is pretty much non-existent, so it mostly falls to the gameplay. Your plot is basically just set up. You play as the crew of a spaceship belonging to the Galactic Federation, which is on the verge of collapse after this horrible war with the rebel forces. And you're basically trying to outrun the rebel fleet that's following you in order to get vastly needed intel to the Federation fleet. To do this, you have to go through various sectors of space, traveling from warp point to warp point, and dealing with the various events that arise. Once you get to the end, you give the data to the fleet, and you have to fight off the rebel fleet. Pretty simple, really. And basically, it's just the fate of the Federation rests in your hands. So, fairly typical sci-fi kind of story, and it works pretty well for the most part. But what about the gameplay? Well, the gameplay is pretty interesting. It's mostly a very simple game in its mechanics. You control the crew members. You have them going from place to place in the ship and, for example, manning the guns. And when they're manning the guns, they reload faster, or at least charge up faster, and might be more accurate, things like that. You send them to the med bay and they heal up. You send them to the engine room and they make the engines improved. If you have a guy in the cockpit, he's piloting the ship, which in turn makes it easier to dodge weapons, and you charge up your FTL drive, so if you're wanting to make a getaway, you need somebody in the pilot seat, and so on and so forth. You start off with 3 crew members, although you can get more as you progress through the game, through various events. And the game itself, apart from controlling your crew, is spent either doing combat or dealing with these various events that come up. The combat is pretty simple. It's a sort of real-time with pause thing, where your weapons have a charge-up time. You select which ones you want to use, although they require energy bars to actually use, so make sure your energy bars are sufficient to actually power up your weapons, as well as the other things you need. And then you let those charge up, and you can target them to specific areas of the ship that you're fighting. And what you're basically trying to do is reduce the enemy's ship down to a degree where they'll either surrender or you can destroy them. Other things you can do, if you get later in the game and you get access to certain things, you'll get, for example, a teleportation device, which you can use to send your guys over to try to take over the enemy ship. Obviously, if you take over an enemy ship, you're going to be able to get more salvage and things like that than if you just destroy it. Although, destroying things may or may not be more advantageous. It just depends on the situation. You start off, obviously, and you're fighting things that aren't really all that tough, and then the further and further you get in the game, the harder and harder things get, in fairly typical roguelike style. Now, the roguelike stuff comes in where the warp points are concerned. When you go from a warp point to another warp point, you will find that everything is randomly generated. The various sectors of space are randomly generated. The warp points themselves are randomly generated. And so, you're never going to really play the same exact game twice. It's going to be different events. You may encounter the same events that you've encountered before, but they'll be in different locations and have different outcomes depending on what you choose. So there is a bit of role-playing in there. But it's certainly not a role-playing game. And once you learn how the game actually works, you can find patterns. And obviously there are certain things, once you know it, you're going to be like, well, I'm going to do this all the time no matter what, because this is the best way to resolve this conflict, for example. And it may get you a crew member, it may get you a device for your ship, whether it be a weapon or a subsystem, for example, drone control, where you can actually have drones around your ship if you have drone parts to use along with them, and they can either attack incoming projectiles or repair the ship or attack the enemy ship or all sorts of different things. Cloaking devices for your ship, that sort of thing. As you progress, you'll get salvage, which you can use to upgrade your ship by either buying energy bars or repairing your ship or things like that. Salvage is your currency, basically. And so you use that to get upgrades to your ship, and as you upgrade your ship, obviously you'll have more and more access to better and better things. The idea is that by the end of the game, you better hope that you're capable of taking on the final boss, which is the Rebel flagship. And the Rebel flagship is incredibly hard to take down. It has a huge amount of shielding, tons of weapons, things absolutely enormous, so you had to take down a lot of systems to actually be able to bring the whole thing down. It's one hell of a fight. And if you do manage to beat that final boss, it is incredibly satisfying. You feel like you could conquer anything. And then you start up a new game of FTL and you die within the first few warp points. Because that's just how it goes. Sometimes you do well, sometimes you don't. Sometimes it can be incredibly frustrating, sometimes it can be incredibly fun. It runs the gamut. That's just kind of how roguelike style games are. And in this game, it's more fun than it isn't. Sometimes it can be incredibly frustrating if you do manage to have a really, really bad run, don't get me wrong. But usually you do just well enough that you don't feel like the game is just being evil for the sake of being evil. Although in the case of Advanced Edition, it can feel like that sometimes because they added in quite a lot of harder content into the game. So that can be kind of frustrating if you're playing Advanced Edition. So if you're new to the game, I do recommend playing just the base game, not using the Advanced Edition content. But if you're more experienced, then the Advanced Edition content is actually good to have. It expands on the already pretty substantial amount of content in the original game and adds in quite a few new features that are very nice to have, particularly if you're a veteran and you know how to play the game. Shakes things up quite a bit. But for new people, it can be incredibly frustrating because the new content is often very, very difficult. So, what is FTL in a nutshell? It's a strategy roguelike style game. It's not a roguelike, it's a roguelike-like, which is an incredibly stupid genre name, but it fits. It has a lot of roguelike elements, and at the same time it's a sort of strategy game, with a few role-playing elements here and there, that comes together as a pretty unique experience. It's very, very easy to pick up and play, with quite a lot of nuance to it, that will leave you actually wanting to play it more and more. And, of course, the Advanced Edition content, for those of you who may have played this game before, but just decided to put it aside and haven't checked it out since that update, is well worth checking out, particularly if you enjoy the game. And it is worth noting to those of you who are immediately turned off by the phrase roguelike-like, I don't like roguelikes, but I like FTL. It's a very solid game that's well worth checking out. I give it a 4 out of 5. Thanks for watching.